Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Well, this video is about the man behind me, whom you've hopefully recognized as Charles de Gaulle. So he's got a statue here in London, even though he's only resident in this city for 4 years of his life. So he's almost unique in having a statue here, despite having spent such a short period of his 80 years here. So he was born in France. His father was a headmaster. They were a conventionally Catholic family, not especially political. And Charles de Gaulle, he decided he wanted to be an army officer, and there was conscription in France. So you had to do your ordinary national service for 2 years first of all, and then apply to Saint-Cyr, the French military academy, where he did very well. And then he became an infantry officer. It's worth mentioning infantry because, of course, there's plenty of cavalry around then by the time he was commissioned, which was about 1911. But he foresaw the possibility of warfare developing, and he wrote a novel imagining that in 1940 France would be invaded by Germany and the Germans would use armoured cars. It was incredibly prescient. Anyway, so then the First World War broke out and he fought gallantly. He fought the Battle of Verdun. That's a city due east of Paris and had been a very important linchpin of French national defence in the 17th century. Vauban had built various these sort of star-shaped forts there with interlocking fields of fire. They'd obviously been continuously updated up to the First World War. And the Germans weren't making progress on the Western Front. They occupied almost the whole of Belgium, a slice of northern France, but they couldn't quite break the Allies. But they thought what they'd do is they'd draw the French into a battle which the French couldn't afford to lose, couldn't afford to give ground, and cause the French such high casualties they would be obliged to seek peace terms. Although it didn't quite work. Anyway, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria was put in charge of the German assault. To start off with, it went quite well for them. They captured one of the forts at Douaumont. Some of the French defences were underground, all these tunnels and artillery pieces, and so the Germans managed to climb in the ventilation duct and capture lots of artillerymen. But anyway, the French did everything they had at Verdun, and it was a veritable hell. There's only one road they could use to supply the troops everything they needed, and it's called La Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. So the French commander there was Henri Philippe Pétain, and Pétain said, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. It was so nerve-wracking for the French troops that they rotated their army in and out, put them in the front line for a couple of months and take them out and put some more French troops in. So by the end of the war, more than 2/3 of the French army had spent some time at Verdun. Otherwise, the French just would put a unit in the front line and leave them there for months and months and months. They'd be incredibly depleted. The British have been rotating people between the front line and the rear since quite early in the war. Anyway, he was captured at Verdun, spent some time in Germany as a prisoner of war, attempted to escape a few times. So the war was over, he was married, he started to have children. He was part of the French military mission to Poland, advising the Poles. So France, certainly since 1894, had had an ally in Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire. Well, that was gone. There was the Soviet Union being founded, and most of the French were very anti-communist. There was a small but vociferous communist party in France. So what were they to do? They were worried about a resurgent Germany, so therefore they needed an ally to Germany's east to face Germany the threat of encirclement. The Germans wouldn't want another two-front war, and therefore the French policy was to beef Poland up as much as possible. And moreover, the Poles were attacking the fledgling Soviet Union. So the French weren't actually fighting, they were just advising the Poles on this one. The Poles were very Francophile, and there'd been a large Polish exile community in France. So there's obviously an anomaly since France had been an ally of Poland's enemy, the Russian Empire. Anyway, won't go too much into that, but Poland back then was a bit larger than it is now and a bit further east. So that was that. He rose up the ranks through the 1920s and 1930s and thought that France really ought to mechanise its army enough, was not keeping up to date, but there was a slump, there was high unemployment, there was this huge war debt which was incredibly difficult for the government to handle. France was almost in permanent political crisis, changing prime minister at the rate of every 3 months. You ask the average Frenchman then who's your prime minister, he wouldn't have known. Or sorry, it would have been President of the Council was the actual title of Prime Minister at the time. And then the Great Depression came, which impacted France even more severely than most Western European countries. So the French didn't have a lot of money to be spending on defence, though they did build up the Maginot Line, Maginot, named after the French defense minister, a series of underground forts, of barbed wire, fences, of landmines and so on Germany's eastern frontier, just in case Germany tried to attack them again. But anyway, go forward to the war, and that war broke out. France declared war on the Third Reich in sympathy with France's ally Poland, but didn't take any offensive action. Their entire strategy was entirely defensive. Sorry for that tautology, entirely. But de Gaulle was the one who led a brief foray into Germany. It was quite successful, using some armour, but it just wasn't followed up. They weren't invested enough in it. And the Poles said, well, if you launch a major attack in the west, that will distract the Germans sufficiently. They'll have to pull troops out of Poland in order to fend off their flank. But the Allies are not doing it. And the British Army was only just expanding. Conscription was increasing. So the war broke out, and I won't go through the Battle of France, but anyway, 10th of May was a German assault on the west, and within 6 weeks, France had capitulated, so had Belgium, the Netherlands, and indeed Luxembourg. So right before France threw in the towel, de Gaulle flew here to London, and then he broadcast in the building opposite. I'll show it to you in a minute, saying France has lost the battle, but not the war, and urging people to carry on, forming the French Committee of National Liberation here at Carlton Gardens. And that was that. Now, he was not the most senior general of the French army. Later, he was tried in absentia by a French court-martial and sentenced to death. You know, a soldier obeys order, like it or not. Otherwise, army simply can't function. You're ordered to lay down your arms, you do it. The civilian government had ordered him to do it. The French National Assembly had voted for the armistice, 85% of them, and they created the French state, no longer the French Republic, with Pétain, remember, the victor of Verdun, as their chief of state. That was his title, not president or prime minister. So this is where he set himself up, and he broadcast on the BBC to France and carried on leading the French Committee of National Liberation. Now, the Allies were distinctly lukewarm on him. Remember, the French Committee of National Liberation symbol was the cross of Lorraine, referring to the early 15th century fight against the English, ironically, led by Joan of Arc. That's a cross with a second horizontal bar. And as Churchill said, the heaviest cross I have to bear is the cross of Lorraine. And he found de Gaulle very difficult to deal with. So there's some other French exiles here for the army, the navy, civilians likewise. And that was that. Some of them, after the surrender of France, they even chose to go back and say, okay, we accept it. We're out of the war, that's that. The British are unfaithful allies. They left us in the lurch at Dunkirk. Then there was Marcel Cabir with the Royal Navy. They killed over 1,000 French sailors when France was actually at peace with the UK. So a bit of a presentational difficulty for de Gaulle being a British ally. But the Allied governments weren't sure what to make of de Gaulle. Do we accept him as a leader or not? I mean, who's he? He's not a politician. He has very questionable legitimacy. And there were several different French resistance groups. Remember, the Communist Party in France, until June 1940, was all for collaboration with the Third Reich. When the Soviet Union was invaded, that suddenly changed, and Maurice Thoré, the French communist leader, was in exile in Moscow, broadcasting to France, lying, claiming he was in France, and urging people to take up arms against the Third Reich. Anyway, so the Allies, they said, all right, we'll recognize you as chairman of the Committee of National Liberation, but not the French head of state. Anyway, later on, de Gaulle, he went to Moscow for consultations with Comrade Stalin. And de Gaulle considered it vital that France have troops serving on all fronts in this war. And he recognized that the Soviet Union was going to emerge from this war much mightier than it got into it. So he flew via Baku onto Moscow, and he met Joseph Stalin, and then back, spending another 2 nights in Moscow, not another 2 nights in Baku, rather. You can see a plaque on the tower where he stayed, and then back here. Of course, he was only told about D-Day 2 days before it commenced. So 6th of June 1944, the Canadians, Americans, and British landing in Normandy, and it was very touch and go whether it was going to succeed, but succeed it did. Several thousand Allied troops were killed that day. Of course, the Soviets might point out that several thousand men being killed in one day would have been a quiet day on the Eastern Front, and people of erstwhile Soviet countries are quite often rightly bitter that the Western Allies didn't pull their weight. They let the Soviets be killed in their millions, whilst the Western Allies suffered relatively light casualties. That's true, unflattering, and unwelcome though that truth is for many Occidentals. Anyway, so right after D-Day, he returned to France, and there, August 1944, when Paris is liberated, you can see him walking around up and down Les Champs-Élysées to l'Arc de Triomphe with Churchill. Of course, they're little and large because de Gaulle was about 6'5". So that was that. He ruled France as president from 1944 to 46, trying to sort out post-war France. And controversially, vitally, he gave the vote to women. Now, that was partly because he thought they're more likely to be anti-communist and more religious, and their Catholic priests were telling them to vote against communist candidates. Well, that's worked for them, although France briefly had a coalition which the communists were part. 1946, he stood down as president, and the Allies were deeply worried lest the French be too attracted to him as a Caesar figure, remembering Napoleon III, Napoleon, General Boulanger, who some had thought would be the savior of the country, or even Pétain himself. Pétain is more popular than people would like to admit these days. There are other things. I remember an opinion poll in the 1980s when it said something like 50% of French people could not condemn Pétain for what he did. And Pétain was obviously put on trial after the war, sentenced to death, but in view of his advanced age and his heroic service in the First World War, was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was incarcerated on Ile du Ré. He died at the age of 95. So what else can I point about de Gaulle? So he was in retirement at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, his home village. But then there was the Algerian conflict, and he initially thought that France should fight on till victory. But he became president again in 1958. There was then the Fifth Republic. We still got the Fifth Republic, more or less designed with him in mind. He was the only one they felt could sort it out, and a lot of communists voted for him to be president, as he felt that he was the only answer. And he went out to Algeria, assessed the situation, and realized it was hopeless. That was that. France was simply going to have to pull out of Algeria, recognize reality, grant independence, and les pieds noirs, the French citizens who were immigrants to Algeria, were going to have to like it or lump it. You can stay in Algeria and take your chances. You can go home to metropolitan France, but either case, we are not fighting to control Algeria. It's just no longer sustainable, keeping Algeria as part of France, despite the fact that clearly a majority of Algerians do not want that. So some people considered him a Judas for that, and the L'Organisation Armée Secrète was formed, the OAS, which pointed out that under the French Constitution, the primary duty of the president was to maintain the territorial integrity of the Republic. So they felt that he betrayed his presidential oath, and they made an attempt to assassinate him, shooting at his car in the presence of his wife. Anyway, some of these plotters were arrested, and they were sentenced to death by firing squad. Would de Gaulle pardon them? Well, he said he wouldn't. A leading factor in motivating him to confirm the death sentences was they'd shot at him when his wife was present, and they could very easily have killed her by accident. So they were put to death. So then he was re-elected, and in 1968, just after his re-election, that was May 1968, the uprising, as it were, really of far-left students and trades unionists. I don't think it was actually killed. Uprising might not be quite the right word, but it was le 68. Generally, it was a year of protest by the counterculture, by all sorts of radicals in the United States, in Ireland, in Czechoslovakia, in France, and so forth. So that was that, despite him just having won an election. Anyway, he felt that perhaps his time had come. And so in 1969, he retired as president early, ahead of schedule. He was very close to his family, particularly his youngest daughter, who was Down syndrome, who obviously always lived with him, who never married, of course. Anyway, he died quite suddenly in 1970, and being a man of immense modesty, he insisted that he have no state funeral. He wanted a small, quiet funeral in his hometown of Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, where indeed he is laid to rest.